What if I told you that one of the largest wealth transfers in human history has already happened, and almost no one in America even noticed it? There were no emergency meetings, no breaking news alerts, no red banners flashing across financial television, just a quiet, deliberate shift of $6.5 trillion moving beneath the surface while the public was distracted by politics, culture wars, and short-term market noise. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't just luck. It was triggered intentionally, patiently, and strategically, and the country that triggered it was China. Most people still think global power shifts happen through wars, sanctions, or dramatic collapses. They imagine tanks, treaties, and bold headlines. But real power rarely moves that way anymore. Real power moves through balance sheets, supply chains, reserves, and silent capital flows. It moves just slowly enough that people don't panic until it is far too late to react. That's exactly what just happened. While Americans were watching interest rate debates, election drama, and stock market volatility, China was executing a transition that economists will be studying for decades. A transition away from paper claims and into physical control. Away from promises and into assets. Away from dollars and into the raw materials that make the modern world function. Now, this wasn't about selling U.S. assets in some dramatic crash. It was much more sophisticated than that. China didn't dump markets. It drained leverage. It redirected reserves. It converted its exposure. Over time, quietly and methodically, they shifted trillions out of financial instruments and into real, irreplaceable inputs of global civilization. Here is the part that most people still don't understand. Wealth doesn't just disappear during these transitions. It moves. Someone loses purchasing power and someone else gains control. Someone ends up holding currency units that buy less every year, while someone else ends up holding the things everyone will need, regardless of the price. That is the $6.5 trillion shift. And it didn't happen all at once. It happened transaction by transaction, cargo shipment by cargo shipment, contract by contract, mining right by mining right, reserve adjustment by reserve adjustment. It happened through metals, energy inputs, industrial materials, infrastructure exposure, and non-dollar trade settlements. It happened through China exchanging its claims on the old system for ownership inside the next one. Think about this for a moment. For decades, China ran massive trade surpluses with the United States. They accepted dollars in exchange for real goods, real labor, and real production. Over time, those dollars piled up into the largest foreign currency reserve stockpile in history. For years, critics asked the same question: what happens when China decides it does not want to hold paper anymore? Well, that moment is no longer theoretical. It already happened. Instead of announcing anything, instead of challenging the dollar directly, China did something far more effective. They used those dollars to buy the things the dollar can't print: metals, energy security, processing capacity, strategic stockpiles, supply chain choke points. They turned their financial exposure into physical leverage. And while Americans debated whether inflation was transitory, China was treating inflation as inevitable and positioning itself accordingly. This is where the wealth shift begins to make sense. Inflation isn't just rising prices. Inflation is a transfer mechanism. It transfers purchasing power from currency holders to asset holders, from savers to owners, from wage earners to the controllers of scarce inputs. And when that inflation happens at a global reserve currency level, the transfer doesn't stay domestic. It becomes international. China understood that before almost anyone else. They understood that the future economy wouldn't be constrained by demand. It would be constrained by supply, by access to materials, by control over processing, by who owns the pipes, not who owns the paper contracts. So they moved first. They expanded their dominance in rare earth processing. They increased strategic reserves of copper, aluminum, nickel, lithium, cobalt, silver, and specialty alloys. They secured long-term supply agreements across Africa, South America, and Central Asia. They invested in refining, smelting, and downstream capacity, not just extraction. They locked themselves into the very center of future industrial demand. And they did it while prices were still relatively low in dollar terms. That's the part that hurts the most if you're holding dollars today. The conversion happened before the full force of inflation showed up in the official numbers. It happened before shortages became obvious, before the public narrative shifted. That's how smart capital always moves, early, quietly, and without asking for permission. Meanwhile, what were Americans being told? That the system was stable, that the dollar was strong, that nothing fundamental was changing, that global demand for dollars was permanent, and that our reserve currency status was unchallenged. We were told supply chains could be rebuilt quickly if needed. None of that turned out to be true, because reserve currency strength isn't just about confidence. It's about usage. It's about settlement. It's about whether other nations need your currency to function. And China has been systematically reducing that need, not just for itself, but for its trading partners. More bilateral trade agreements settled outside the dollar. more commodity contracts priced in alternative currencies, more financial infrastructure built parallel to Western systems. The goal wasn't to overthrow the dollar overnight, but to make dependence on it optional. That's how you weaken a system without attacking it directly. Now here's the uncomfortable truth for Americans. This $6.5 trillion wealth shift didn't require China to win anything. It only required the US to do what it has already been doing, running massive deficits, expanding its debt, monetizing shortfalls, and assuming global demand would always absorb the excess. China didn't force that behavior. They simply adapted to it faster than everyone else. And adaptation is where wealth goes during major transitions. If you're still thinking this is all about stock markets, you're missing the point. Markets are just the surface. Underneath them are the flows, resource flows, capital flows, trade flows. And once those flows change direction, the visible outcomes can lag by years. That's why most Americans didn't notice. Their portfolios still showed numbers. Their bank accounts still worked. Their wages still arrived. Prices rose, sure, but gradually enough to be explained away. But beneath that surface of normalcy, the entire foundation shifted. And once foundations shift, certain outcomes become unavoidable. Because when the next phase begins, when resource competition intensifies, when supply constraints harden, when financial claims are tested against physical reality, the question won't be who has the most dollars. It will be who controls what dollars can no longer easily buy. And that's where this story is going next, because what China triggered wasn't just a wealth shift, it triggered a sequence, a chain reaction that's already moving into its second phase. And once you see how phase 2 works, you'll understand why this isn't over. In fact, it's just beginning to accelerate. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe to see what happens next. Have you ever felt like you're working harder but falling further behind? Like the ground is shifting beneath your feet, but you can't quite put your finger on why. It's not just a feeling, it's the result of a massive, silent wealth transfer that has already happened and most people didn't even notice. But its effects are now showing up in places we can't ignore. In the price of groceries, at the gas pump, and in a constant hum of financial instability that seems to come out of nowhere. To most people, it all looks like chaos, but to those who understand the pattern, it's almost mechanical. See, while everyone was focused on stocks and digital currencies, trillions of dollars were quietly being converted out of paper promises and into physical, tangible assets. Now the remaining paper has to absorb that adjustment. That's the pressure Americans are feeling right now, even if they don't connect the dots. The dollar isn't collapsing in some dramatic Hollywood movie scene. It's something slower, more structural. It is losing purchasing power against the things that actually matter in a world where supply chains are tight. We're talking about energy, metals, everything needed to grow our food, and the industrial components that build our modern world. And here's the crazy part. Every time our system tries to fix itself by printing more money or adding more debt, it just speeds up the very problem it's trying to solve. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Now, China saw this coming. They understood this feedback loop perfectly. They knew that once inflation became a real, unavoidable problem, Western governments would be stuck between a rock and a hard place. If they raise interest rates too aggressively, they risk crashing their own debt-heavy economies. But if they loosen the reins and keep printing money, they destroy the credibility of their currency. Either way, capital starts fleeing from promises and running towards real, scarce things. So what did China do? They positioned themselves to be the owner of that scarcity. This is why this whole shift isn't just about money. It's about leverage. It's about having options. It's about who gets to say no when prices skyrocket. It's about who dictates the terms when shortages pop up. It's about who controls the processing plants, not just who digs the raw materials out of the ground. Americans didn't see this happening because leverage doesn't show up on your monthly brokerage statement. It shows up later. It shows up when supply chains start to creak and groan. It shows up when our own industries are suddenly competing for basic materials. It shows up when governments realize that bringing manufacturing back home is not just about building new factories. It's about getting the materials those factories desperately need. And it shows up when military planners realize their most advanced defense systems depend on components that come from networks controlled by rivals. At that point, just throwing money at the problem doesn't work. What you need is time, and time is the one thing you can't buy or speed up. This is where the wealth shift becomes irreversible, because you can print trillions of dollars in an afternoon. You cannot print a new copper deposit. You cannot print a lithium brine field. You can't instantly create decades of processing expertise, or fast-track environmental approvals, or build the massive infrastructure that took others a generation to construct. And you certainly cannot print trust in long-term supply agreements. China didn't just buy up materials. They bought time. They bought future capacity. They essentially bought an insurance policy against the volatility that everyone else is now completely exposed to. And that exposure is spreading like wildfire. As more and more countries feel the squeeze of higher costs and unreliable supplies, They're facing the same choice China already made years ago. Do we hold on to rapidly devaluing paper currency, or do we convert it into something real? Do we stay dependent on others, or do we secure our own access to critical resources? Do we trust the open market, or do we take control of our own logistics? Every single time a country chooses to convert their paper holdings into physical assets, the global pool of paper claims gets a little smaller, while the demand for physical stuff gets a little bigger, and that puts even more pressure on the people left holding the bag, which primarily is the United States and anyone else holding large amounts of US dollars. This is how a colossal wealth shift happens without making front-page news. It's not a dramatic event. It's a slow, steady process. That's also why framing this as a simple China versus America showdown misses the point entirely. This isn't really a conflict. It's an evolution. It's the entire global economic system shifting its center of gravity. And complex systems like this don't care about our feelings or political debates. They respond to one thing: incentives. The incentive structure has fundamentally changed. In a world of ever-expanding debt, the system rewards those who convert their paper wealth into real assets early. The ones who wait, who hold on to the old promises, end up paying the price. So why didn't Americans notice? Because the cost is delayed. It doesn't hit you all at once. It arrives gradually, then suddenly. It shows up as that nagging feeling that your money just doesn't go as far as it used to. It shows up as higher bills for everything. It shows up as wild swings in the financial markets that seem totally disconnected from how hard you're working or how productive your company is. It's that feeling that the goalposts keep moving no matter what you do. That feeling isn't in your head. It's pure mathematics. A shift of over $6.5 trillion has already taken place. We are now just living through the fallout, the distributional effects of that massive change. And here is the hardest truth of all. By the time a wealth transfer becomes obvious to the majority of people, it's already over. The crisis you see on the news is never the transfer itself. It's the aftermath. China understood this. That's why they didn't hold a press conference. They didn't need to. They just let the system do what it always does at the end of a long debt cycle. So now, the question isn't whether this process will reverse. It won't. The real question is whether you, as an individual, can understand what's happening in time to adapt. This isn't about panicking or making risky speculative bets. It's about fundamentally recognizing the difference between nominal value, the number on a screen, and real control, real ownership of tangible things. The next decade isn't going to reward people who just memorize the old rules of finance. It will reward those who understand what has fundamentally changed. And what's changed is actually quite simple, even if its implications are massive. Wealth is moving away from abstract promises and back towards physical reality. It's moving away from infinite digital tokens and toward finite essential resources. It's shifting away from systems built on trust alone and towards systems built on proven physical access. China didn't cause this shift all by itself, but they saw it coming, and they acted on it early and at an incredible scale. And while most Americans didn't notice when it all started, we are all going to feel it as it continues to unfold. Because this story is far from over. Think of it this way. Phase 1, the silent accumulation, is done. Phase 2, the visible instability and repricing of everything, is happening right now. And Phase 3 will determine who successfully adapts to this new reality, and who is left holding claims on a world that simply does not exist anymore. But once you truly grasp that, you stop asking why everything feels so unstable. You start asking a much more important question. Where is the real value moving next? Thanks for watching. If this gave you a new perspective, consider subscribing for more content that looks beyond the headlines. See you next time.